Hello and welcome to the Very Audible Stories. In today's videos, it would be a stories about a hidden kindness coming from a mafia bosses whom everyone feared. If you like these videos, please share your thoughts on the comment sections and subscribe to the channel to receive notifications about new videos. Thank you.
The tin box sat on the restaurant floor. Its lid had sprung open. Coins rolled across the white tile, a quarter spinning slowly beneath a table leg before falling still in the silence. Folded bills lay scattered between two pairs of shoes. One pair of black heels on polished clean tile, one pair of flats worn down more on the left heel than the right. No one bent to pick them up. 4 people stood around and looked down in silence. 45 minutes earlier, nothing had broken yet. She stood on the sidewalk in front of the most expensive Italian restaurant in South Boston. Both hands wrapped around a rectangular tin box, one corner dented, the faded outline of flowers still printed on the outside. It was old, not old in the expensive vintage way people put on shelves to look pretty. Old in the way something gets when it has passed through the hands of 2 generations of women in one family, and no one ever had enough money to buy a new one. Inside it were $623. Coins, folded bills slipped through the slit in the lid. 7 months of saving. Every dollar that remained after rent, after food, after $97 a month for her grandmother's lung medicine, after electricity, bus fare, and the small things. Only someone living alone and paying for everything alone knows, can add up faster than seems possible. Marin Calloway, 27 years old. Light brown hair tied back in haste. Short nails, still shadowed with bruised stains from industrial dish soap. A Goodwill coat, flats worn thinner on the left heel than the right, because she leaned her weight that way while standing to wash glasses for 6 hours every night. She knew this restaurant. She mopped its kitchen floor 5 days a week, always entering through the back door, where the air smelled of grease and pans clanged against each other and nobody looked at her twice. Today she stood at the front door. Clear glass, gold lettering, warm light spilling onto the sidewalk like an invitation meant for certain people. Just not for her. The distance between the back door and the front door of Il Sogno was only 15 steps around the corner of the wall. But those 15 steps were wider than any boulevard in this city. She wanted to make a reservation, a private table, for 2, the 7-course tasting menu, next Tuesday, paid in full in advance, for her grandmother Martha, 76 years old, living with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, needing oxygen every day, and never once in her life having sat down to eat in a restaurant. Not because she didn't deserve it, because all her life she had been busy making herself worthy for everyone else. She drew in a breath. Then she walked in through the front door. She didn't look around. She didn't lift her eyes to the dark wood ceiling, or the low-hanging lights, or the white tablecloths, or the exposed brick walls that critics called rustic chic, and Marin called the walls she scrubbed splattered grease from every Monday morning. She walked straight to the host stand. She spoke clearly, without circling the point, in the voice of someone who had spent her whole life practicing how to say exactly what she needed, because she had never had the time or the interest to say anything more. I'd like to reserve a private table for 2 next Tuesday, the 7-course tasting menu, and I'll pay in full today. The 2 girls behind the stand looked at each other. That glance lasted only half a second, but that half second carried everything. It was the kind of look people give each other when they've already decided who someone is before that person has even finished the first sentence. Quick. Practiced. The special cruelty of people who think they're being discreet when the whole room can see. Paige Harmon, 22, covered her mouth, but one shoulder shook once. Tara Noonan, 24, didn't look away, but she didn't say anything either. And then from farther inside, Deirdre Walsh stepped out. The manager, 40 years old, gray blazer, a smile shaped correctly but carrying no warmth behind it. She had managed this restaurant for 3 years, and she had a very clear picture in her head of who belonged on the front side of the door and who belonged at the back. Her eyes went downward first, shoes, then upward, coat, then across. The tin box, she said, in the polished, courteous voice worn smooth by hundreds of times, saying no, without ever needing to use the word no. Marin, the tasting menu is $580 before tax and service. Maybe you'd like to look at something a little more suitable. We have pasta bar on Thursdays, $45 a person, very charming, $580. The number dropped into the room not like a door slamming shut. It landed softer than that. It landed the way someone lowers a velvet rope between two kinds of people and calls it customer service. Marin Calloway didn't move. She was 27 years old. She had worked 2 jobs for 4 years, prep cook from 7 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, at this very restaurant, in the very kitchen behind that brick wall. Glass washer from 6 at night until midnight at the bar on Dorchester Avenue. Up at 6, home at 1 in the morning. All of it to pay rent, buy food, pick up Martha's lung medicine from the pharmacy counter every Monday with her own hands instead of getting it delivered so she could save $12 in delivery fees. And that $12 went into the tin box on the kitchen shelf every week for 7 months, until today. She had stood in too many rooms where people looked at her shoes before they looked at her face. She had learned a long time ago that look said more about them than it ever said about her. She looked straight at Deirdre and said, "I know the price. I have enough. I want the reservation." But she didn't know that within the next 45 minutes, that tin box would be lying on the floor. She didn't know that she would walk out of this restaurant not through the back door but through the front door, for the second time. Except this time not because she had chosen to, but because she had been thrown out. She didn't know that a man she had never met would see her sitting on the steps outside his own restaurant, with the tin box resting on her lap and her back still straight, and that something in the way she sat would knock against a door inside him that had been closed for 25 years. She didn't know that the old tin box, corner dented, flowers faded, her grandmother's sewing tin, would be the thing that kept the Shadow King of half of South Boston awake at 3 in the morning, and made him remember the smell of rice through the wall of an apartment in Old Colony 25 years earlier, when he was still a hungry boy, and there was a woman who knocked on the door every night and never once asked why. Marin knew none of that. She only knew that she was standing here, the tin box resting on the marble counter, $623 inside, and she wasn't going anywhere until she had the reservation receipt for the birthday dinner of the woman who had raised her on thread, needles, and meals divided 3 ways. If this story makes you believe that kindness is never wasted, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Press like so the story can reach more people. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change the way you see everything around you. Deirdre tilted her head ever so slightly to one side. The smile was still there, in the right shape, in the right place, but now it had turned sharper, like a thin blade hidden inside gift wrapping. She said, "Marin, I understand how much you love your grandmother, but the restaurant has the right to refuse service. Brand image. Our regular guests expect a certain kind of experience, and if that experience is affected, then we can't." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Her eyes had already said everything from the moment they moved from the worn heels of Marin's shoes to the Goodwill coat, and then stopped at the tin box resting on the marble counter, like something misplaced in a room that had never been meant for it. Marin looked straight at Deirdre. She said, "My grandmother is 76 years old. She has lung disease. She has to breathe with oxygen every day. She has never once in her life sat down to eat in a restaurant, not because she doesn't deserve it, because she spent her whole life taking care of other people, and never once thought about sitting down for herself. She deserves one beautiful dinner, and I have enough money to pay for that dinner." Deirdre didn't move. The smile was still there, but its outline had gone harder. She said, "I understand, but this isn't the right place for this situation. Maybe you should." Marin cut her off. She said, "I mop the kitchen floor in this restaurant 5 days a week. I scrub pots. I wash vegetables. I wipe grease off the brick wall behind your back every Monday morning. I know exactly who this restaurant is suitable for, because I'm the one who cleans it before those people walk in." The room went still, not the polished silence of an upscale restaurant in the middle of the afternoon. The kind of silence that comes when something has just been turned over in front of everyone, and no one knows how to set it back the way it was. Paige Harmon stood frozen, her smile gone. Tara Noonan looked down at her hands. 2 guests at the table by the window lifted their eyes from their wine glasses. Deirdre swallowed once. She wasn't used to being looked at directly by someone she had already sorted into the kind who weren't supposed to look back. She straightened herself again. Then she said, "Marin, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a management decision." She turned to Paige and said something in a low voice. Paige went toward the back. 30 seconds later, a young security guard stepped out from the side door. Young, broad shoulders, uneasy. He didn't want to be here. And that was written on his face more clearly than anything had been written on Deirdre's face in the last 10 minutes. Deirdre said, "Please escort her out." Maren looked at the guard. She didn't look at Deirdre again, because there was nothing left to say to a person who had made up her mind before the conversation had even begun. As the guard stepped forward, his heavy sleeve caught the corner of the tin box, sending it crashing onto the floor. The lid sprung open, and $623 in coins and folded bills scattered across the white tile, just as they had been faded to 45 minutes earlier. The 4 people stood around and looked down, but no one bent to help. Maren Calloway did not cry. She knelt and gathered her 7 months of savings with quiet, steady hands, her back remaining as straight as a line. Once the box was closed, she stood, picked it up, and said very calmly, "I'll leave on my own." She turned and walked toward the front door. Not the back door. The back door was closer. The back door was more familiar. The back door would have been much easier, because it was the door she had passed through thousands of times, and no one ever looked at her twice when she went through it. But she didn't go to the back door. She went to the front, the same door she had walked in through. She pushed it open. Clear glass, gold letters, warm light falling over her shoulder onto the sidewalk. She stepped outside. She didn't lower her head. She didn't walk any faster. She didn't look back. Behind her, Deirdre was saying something to Tara, her voice low and quick, the voice of someone trying to reassure herself that she had been right. Behind her, the young guard stood at the door, watching her with the face of a man who had just witnessed something he would remember far longer than he realized. Maren didn't know any of that. She knew the sidewalk beneath her feet. She knew the tin box in her hands, heavier now than when she had carried it in, because now it held the added weight of the last 15 minutes. She sat down on the concrete step beside the main entrance of Il Sogno. She placed the tin box on her lap. Both hands rested on the lid. Her back stayed straight. Tuesday afternoon. South Boston moved past in front of her. Pedestrians, cars, a horn somewhere in the distance. The smell of coffee drifting from the cafe 3 doors down. No one looked at her. A woman sitting on a step in South Boston in the middle of the afternoon wasn't the kind of sight that stirred questions in the minds of people passing by. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She didn't know what the next step was. She only knew she wasn't going anywhere, because the tin box was still full, and Martha still didn't have her birthday dinner, and if it wasn't going to be this restaurant, then it would be another one. But it would be a restaurant, because she had made that promise to herself 7 months ago, and she wasn't the kind of person who broke promises to herself. She remained there, the heirloom box steady on her lap, her posture unyielding, and she didn't know that someone was walking toward her. Brennan McGuire walked along the sidewalk from Moira's cafe, 3 doors down from Il Sogno, a black coffee in his right hand, no sugar, no cream, the same as every afternoon he stopped in here over the last 4 years, because Moira had known his mother back in the old colony days, and always asked after her whenever he came through the door. He never announced himself before coming to the restaurant. He never did. 15 years in the world he lived in had taught him that the truest version of anything only appeared when no one knew they were being watched. He wanted to see Il Sogno the way customers saw it, not the version that had been polished and adjusted 30 minutes before the owner arrived. He was tall, broad-shouldered, black coat, no suit, a faint scar running across the bridge of his nose from a night 12 years earlier that he never told anyone about, and no one ever dared ask. His eyes scanned. It happened before he had time to think, before he had time to decide whether he wanted to scan or not. Like a heartbeat, like breathing, like the way a man who has lived a long time in darkness learns to read everything in 3 seconds, because 3 seconds can be the distance between getting home and never getting home again. In the first 3 seconds of looking at a room, a street, a corner booth, he already knew who was dangerous, who was pretending, who was afraid, who was hiding something behind their back. 3 seconds. He had lived by those 3 seconds for 15 years. But the 3 seconds this afternoon were different. He saw her before he reached the door of Il Sogno. The woman, sitting on the concrete step beside the front entrance of his restaurant. Her hair was pulled back in a hurried knot. A thin coat shielded her from the wind, and her scuffed flats told the story of long hours spent standing at a sink. An old tin box rested on her lap, both hands anchoring the lid. She sat with unbowed shoulders, waiting. Not crying, not looking at her phone, not waiting for anyone. She was sitting there with the posture of a person who wasn't folding in on herself, wasn't begging, wasn't performing anything for anyone passing by, only sitting in the space between having just been refused something and not yet knowing what she would do next. And in that space, she still held her back straight, as if that was the last thing she would let go of. And she hadn't decided to let go of it yet. 3 seconds. Brennan could read many things in 3 seconds. He could read danger in 3 seconds. He could read a lie in 3 seconds. He could read fear in 3 seconds. But in these 3 seconds, he read something else, and it made his steps slow, then stop altogether. Something in the way she sat, in the peculiar stillness around her, in the quiet force held in the straight line of her spine, and the way both hands rested on the tin box lid, not to hold it down but to anchor herself. He had seen that somewhere before. A very long time ago. He couldn't quite reach it. It lay at the deepest level of memory, where the oldest things sink and only rise again when something in the present accidentally strikes the exact same frequency. He still couldn't name it, but something inside him recognized it. The way you recognize a smell from long ago, before your mind can tell you which room it belonged to, which person it belonged to, which season of your life it came from. He stood on the sidewalk 4 steps away from her, coffee in his right hand. She didn't look up. She didn't know he was there. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know he owned the restaurant that had just thrown her out. She was only sitting on the step, the tin box on her lap, her back straight, thinking about which restaurant would take her money next. Brennan looked at her for another moment. Then he stepped forward. He said, his voice level, carrying the kind of quiet that didn't need volume to carry weight. The kind of voice the people who worked for him had learned to listen to very carefully, because when Brennan Maguire spoke softly, things mattered far more than when he spoke loud. What happened? Not a question. There was no question mark in his voice, just 2 words laid down in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon like an open door that the person on the other side could choose to walk through or not. Marin looked up. She saw a man she didn't know. Black coat, faint scar across the bridge of his nose, coffee in his hand, eyes on her with no pity in them, no cheap curiosity, no passing glance, looking straight at her. She had no reason at all to speak to a stranger on a South Boston sidewalk on a Tuesday afternoon. But he didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't ask if she needed help. He asked what happened. And that was a different kind of question, because it didn't assume she was weak. It only assumed that something had happened. And she looked at him and decided to answer. She answered briefly. No more, no less. I went into the restaurant to book a birthday dinner for my grandmother. I had the money. They refused. They called security. I walked out on my own. She said it the way she said everything in life. Exactly what needed to be said. Not one word more. Because she had lived long enough with reality to know that reality didn't need decoration. Brennan listened. He didn't ask anything else. He looked at the glass doors of Il Sogno behind her, the gold lettering, the warm light, and he understood exactly what had happened inside without needing to hear another word, because he had grown up on the receiving end of that exact kind of treatment, and he recognized it by instinct, by skin, by the memory of a 12-year-old boy who had been looked at with that same look so many times it had carved itself into his bones. He said, "Wait here." 2 words, no explanation. Then he walked through the front door of Il Sogno. Deirdre was saying something to Tara at the host stand, her voice low and fast, one hand adjusting the lapel of her blazer, the posture of someone rearranging the story inside her own head so that the version she told herself would still be the version in which she was right. She looked up. She saw Brennan. Everything on her face changed within a quarter of a second. Not fear. Not yet, but the thing that comes just before fear. The thing that makes the body go rigid, and the eyes widen by 0.5 millimeter, and the hand adjusting the blazer stop halfway. She said, "Mr. Maguire, we just handled a small situation with a..." Brennan didn't let her finish. He didn't need to hear the version Deirdre told herself. He said, "Back hallway. Now." 3 words. His voice stayed level. His voice stayed quiet. And that very quiet was what made Deirdre follow him at once. Because she had worked for Maguire Holdings long enough to know that when Brennan Maguire went quiet, the space around him didn't go quiet with him. It grew heavier, denser, and everything inside that space had to listen. They went into the hallway behind the kitchen. The door shut. No one heard anything. Paige stood at the host stand, looking at the closed door. Tara stood beside her, looking at the closed door. The 2 guests near the window looked at each other. The young security guard stood in the corner, looking down at his shoes. 45 seconds. No one counted. But everyone could feel that those 45 seconds lasted far longer than ordinary 45 seconds. The hallway door opened. Deirdre came out. Her face was white. Not white like someone who was afraid. White like someone who had just understood that the world she thought she was standing in had changed shape in 45 seconds and would never return to the old one. Her hand trembled slightly. She walked straight to the host stand. She opened the reservation book. She began to write. No one had to tell her what to write. She already knew. Brennan came out of the hallway behind her. He didn't look at Deirdre. He looked at Paige. One look. Not a word. Paige stood still for 2 seconds. Then she walked toward the back, picked up her handbag, picked up her coat, and left through the back door within 3 minutes without saying a word to anyone. Brennan looked at Tara, the 24-year-old woman who hadn't smiled when Marin was humiliated. The young woman who hadn't spoken up, but hadn't joined in either. He said, "You stay." 2 words. Then he went back out through the front door. Marin was still sitting on the step, the tin box on her lap, her back straight. She looked up when he stepped outside. He said, "The table is booked. Next Tuesday. 7-course tasting menu. For 2. You come in and pay." Marin looked at him. She said, "Who are you?" He said, "I own the restaurant." Silence. She looked at the glass door behind him, then back at his face. She said, "I don't need you arranging anything for me. I don't need favors. I came to make a reservation with my money. If the restaurant takes my money, then book it. If not, I'll go somewhere else." Brennan looked at her. The refusal was flat, without drama, without a tremor in her voice, without a single tear attached to it. It was simply absolute, as if accepting help was not a choice she had ever set on the table. He said, "You come in and pay. It's my restaurant, your money, your table. No one is giving you anything." She looked at him for another moment. Then she stood. She picked up the tin box. She walked into Il Sogno through the front door. For the second time that day, she went straight to the host stand. She placed the tin box on the marble counter in front of Deirdre. Deirdre opened the lid. Her hand was still trembling slightly. She took the money out, counted, coins separated one by one across the stone surface, bills unfolded flat and set aside, quarters, dimes, nickels, $1 bills, $5 bills, $10 bills, folded neatly, tucked in carefully, each bill a week, each coin one more time, choosing not to have the medicine delivered in order to save $12. Each bill one step closer to the door she had just walked through for the second time. Deirdre finished counting. $623. The tasting menu for 2, with tax and service included, $618. 5 left over. Deirdre wrote the receipt, set it on the counter, didn't look up. Marin took the receipt. She placed it inside the tin box. She closed the lid. The small click rang through the silent room. She turned. She walked out. The front door. Brennan stood on the step outside. She passed by him. He said, "What's your name?" She stopped. Didn't turn around. She said, Marin Calloway." Then she walked on. Brennan stood on the sidewalk watching her grow smaller down the street. The tin box in her hand, a cloth bag over her shoulder. Her steps even, never looking back. Calloway. The name stayed in his mind after she disappeared around the corner. It didn't hit him all at once. It didn't make him freeze where he stood. It simply remained there, at the edge of memory, scratching lightly, like fingernails tapping on a wooden table in a dark room whose door he had not yet opened. He didn't recognize it yet, but he wasn't going to sleep tonight, and he didn't know why. Calloway. That surname followed him home to the penthouse in the Seaport district that afternoon. It followed him through the elevator doors, down the long hallway, into the wide room overlooking Boston Harbor. It sat with him in the leather chair beside the glass as the city shifted from afternoon into evening and the lights began to come on in clusters along the water. He didn't know why that name wouldn't leave. He didn't know why it kept lingering at the edge of memory, scratching, light and patient, like something waiting for him to open the right door. He poured himself a drink. He drank. He stared out through the glass. And then the memory came. Not from the name itself, but from the thing that had come before the name. Something older, deeper, something resting in that layer where language can't quite reach but the nose can. The smell of rice. He was 12 years old. A public housing apartment in Old Colony. 3rd floor. walls so thin he could hear the neighbor's television and the hiss of a hot pan from the apartment below. Winter. Not the kind of Boston winter that is cold out on the street, because out on the street everybody is cold. The kind of winter that is cold inside the apartment, because the heat works for 2 days and then breaks for 3, and nobody comes to fix it. The kitchen cabinet was empty. Not empty in the way where you're out of milk and bread and need to go to the store. Empty in the way where you open the cabinet door and see the back panel of the pressed wood, because there is nothing standing between your eyes and that wall. His mother sat at the kitchen table. She sat with her back to him. She was looking at the wall. She didn't turn around because she didn't want him to see her face. He was 12, but he already understood why she was staring at the wall. He had understood since he was 10. She looked at the wall because if she turned around he would see her eyes, and he would know that there was nothing to eat tonight either. And she didn't want him to know that by seeing it on her face, even though he already knew, even though the empty cabinet had already said it, even though the ache in his stomach had already said it, but she still looked at the wall because that was how she protected him from the one thing she could still protect him from. Not the hunger itself, but the sight of his mother crying because of that hunger. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her back. 12 years old. Thin, taller than last year, but thinner than last year, because his bones had lengthened faster than food had found its way into him. Then the smell came. Through the wall, from the apartment below. Hot rice. Something cooking on the stove in the apartment directly beneath his feet, and the smell came through the thin wooden floor and into his nose and made his stomach clench harder than it had before the smell arrived, because before that he had been hungry in the familiar way, but now he was hungry in the way that comes from knowing food is close by and not yours. 2 knocks. Always 2 knocks. Not 3, not 1, 2. His mother rose from the kitchen table. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand before turning around. She opened the door. The woman from downstairs stood there, apron on, hair pinned neatly up at the back. Always pinned up, never loose, as though she didn't have time for loose hair because her hands were always doing something. Cooking, sewing, folding, carrying. A plate of rice in her hands, hot. Little threads of steam rising between the 2 women standing in the doorway of a 3rd-floor public housing apartment in Old Colony on a winter evening. She said, "Eat while it's hot." Then she turned away. She didn't step inside. She didn't ask whether they needed anything. She didn't look over his mother's shoulder into the empty kitchen. She didn't wait for thanks. She didn't do a single thing that might make his mother feel 1 millimeter smaller than she had felt before the knock. She simply held out the plate of rice, said "eat while it's hot," and went back to her own kitchen. Every night. 3 years. Not 1 night missed. Not 1 time did she ask again. Not 1 time did she mention it later. Not 1 time did she stay at the door longer than 20 seconds. Because she understood that staying longer than 20 seconds turns help into pity. And she never did that. 2 knocks. A plate of rice. Eat while it's hot. Turn away. 3 years. He remembered that smell more vividly than anything else from Old Colony. Not the smell of the damp apartment. Not the smell of old paint on the walls. Not the smell of the shared hallway after midnight. The smell of hot rice through the wall. That smell was how he knew someone cared, before the knocking ever came. It arrived before the sound. It slipped through the wooden floor, through the wall, through the crack beneath the door. And it told him that downstairs, there was a woman standing at her stove, cooking the 4th portion of rice that day. The portion that wasn't for her own family. The portion meant for the apartment above, where a mother sat staring at the wall, and a 12-year-old boy stood in the kitchen doorway hungry enough that his ribs ached. Behind her, on the kitchen table, there was always a rectangular tin box. 1 corner dented, lid sprung loose, faded flowers printed on the outside. Her sewing tin. He saw it every night over her shoulder, while she stood in the doorway handing that plate of rice to his mother. The box sat there on her kitchen table like something permanent, like the table itself, like the stove, like the woman herself. Always there, every night, for 3 years. Her name was Martha. Martha Calloway. Martha Calloway. Now the full name stood in the middle of the penthouse, like a real person made of flesh and bone. Brennan sat in the leather chair, the glass of whiskey on the table beside him, the city of Boston lit beyond the windows from the 23rd floor, and that name stood across from him, and looked at him, and refused to leave. Calloway. This afternoon on the sidewalk he had heard the surname, and it had only scratched lightly. Now it wasn't scratching anymore. It had torn straight through. Because it wasn't the surname that had opened the door. It was the tin box. That weathered sewing tin, with its familiar dent and faded petals, was the same one he had seen hundreds of times over her shoulder in Old Colony. The same box, the same faded flowers, the same dented corner. 25 years later, it had been resting on the lap of a 27-year-old woman outside his restaurant, and he had stood there with a cup of coffee in his hand, 4 steps away from it, and had not known. He set the glass down. His hand was steady because Brennan Maguire's hand was always steady. 15 years in a world where shaking hands meant weakness, and weakness meant death, had taught him how to keep his hands calm in every circumstance. But inside him there was nothing calm. Inside him, 25 years were snapping loose all at once like a spool of wire cut open, and each loop that sprang free was another winter night in Old Colony, another smell of hot rice through the wall, another pair of knocks, another plate of rice, another eat while it's hot, another back turning away, and the tin box on Martha's kitchen table behind her. Every night, every night, every night, for 3 years. He had looked for her twice, the first time when he was 28. Just after opening his first restaurant with his first dirty money, he hired someone to find her. But Old Colony had changed. Too many families had moved away. The old records were gone. The second time, when he was 32, he tried again. The name Martha appeared in 3 results across 3 different states, and none of them was right. He gave up. Not because he forgot, because he thought life had closed that door, and he had no right to force it open. But now, at 3 in the morning, in the penthouse on the 23rd floor, that door didn't need anyone to force it. It opened by itself. It opened because a young woman named Marin Calloway had walked into his restaurant that afternoon, carrying her grandmother's sewing tin, filled with 7 months of savings, and her grandmother's surname, and her grandmother's straight back and the same refusal of help that Martha had carried. Flat, absolute, not open to negotiation. And he had stood there and watched all of it, without understanding. Until now. The debt he had carried for 25 years had never announced when it would be ready to return. It didn't send a letter. It didn't knock at the door. It waited. It waited 25 years. And then on a Tuesday afternoon, it sat on the steps outside his restaurant, wearing the face of Martha's granddaughter, and he walked past it without knowing. But now he knew. He picked up his phone. He called Connor, 3 in the morning. Connor answered after 2 rings. Because Connor always answered after 2 rings, no matter the hour. That was the rule between the 2 brothers. 2 rings. Never more, never less, no matter if he was asleep or somewhere else or in the middle of anything. Connor picked up, and his voice turned alert at once, because when Brennan called at 3 in the morning, it usually wasn't to check in. When Brennan called at 3 in the morning, it usually meant something needed handling. Someone had betrayed them. Someone's debt was overdue. Someone needed to be reminded that a promise made to Brennan Maguire was not the kind of promise a man got to forget. Connor said, "What is it?" Brennan said, "Find me Marin Calloway's address, South Boston." Connor went silent for a second. Marin Calloway. The name wasn't on any list he was tracking. Not a debtor. Not a rival. Not somebody's inside person. He asked, "What does she owe?" Brennan said nothing. Longer than a second. Longer than 3 seconds. Long enough for Connor to know the answer coming next would not be any answer he had ever heard before. Brennan said, "No, I owe." 2 words. Connor sat up on the edge of his bed in his apartment in Southie and held the phone to his ear and said nothing, because he didn't know what to say. 33 years of being Brennan Maguire's younger brother. 20 years of knowing who his brother was in the underworld. 15 years of driving him to places no one should ever have to go. He had never once heard Brennan say, "I owe." Brennan Maguire didn't owe people. People owed Brennan Maguire. That was how their world worked. That was how their world had always worked. But at 3 in the morning, his brother had called and said, "I owe." And the voice that spoke those 2 words was not the voice of the butcher, not the voice of the head of Maguire Holdings, but the voice of something older, from before all of that, from Old Colony, from the boy Connor had never truly known, because he was only a small child when they finally left that place. Connor said, "I'll find it now." Then he hung up. Brennan set the phone down on the glass table. He looked out the window. Boston at 3 in the morning. Fewer lights now, the harbor black, rain coming soon. He couldn't sleep, and now he knew why. Tuesday. Martha Calloway's birthday. 76 years old. Marin woke at 5 in the morning, 1 hour earlier than usual, because today was not an ordinary day. She had asked for the day off from her prep shift. The first time in 4 years she had asked for time off, not because she was sick, but because she wanted something. She stood in her small bedroom, opened the drawer to take out her watch as she did every morning, and as she had done every morning for the last 3 weeks, she saw the bag of candles lying inside the drawer. 76 candles. She had counted them twice when she bought them. She closed the drawer. Tonight, she walked into her grandmother's room. Martha was already awake, sitting in the chair by the window, the thin oxygen tube running from the machine to her nose, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her back straight as always, because Martha Calloway had never sat with a bent back a single day in her life, not even when her lungs gave her only half the air most people took for granted. Marin said, "Happy birthday, Grandma." Martha looked at her. She said, 76. Too many, Marin said. Not enough. Martha didn't smile, but her eyes did something close to smiling. Brighter for half a second, warmer for half a second, then back to normal, because Martha Calloway was not a woman who left emotion resting on her face for long. Marin opened the wardrobe and took out her grandmother's nicest sweater. Gray, clean, pressed flat. No holes, no worn spots. This was the sweater Martha wore only to the hospital or when someone came to visit, which meant very rarely, because very few people ever came to visit. Marin laid the sweater on the bed. Martha looked at the sweater. Then she looked at Marin. She said, "Where are you taking me?" Marin said, "I already told you. To a restaurant. Tonight." Martha said, "Marin, I don't need a restaurant. You can cook for me." She said it in the same voice she used for everything that concerned herself. Soft, dismissive, as though her own needs were the smallest thing in the room and not worth taking up anyone's time. Marin said, "I'm not asking your opinion. I'm informing you." Martha looked at her granddaughter. A long moment. Then she pressed her lips together. Her eyes lit again. She had lost. She knew she had lost. She lost the way she had lost every argument with Marin over the last 27 years. Not because she was weaker, but because Marin had inherited from her exactly the same stubbornness Martha herself had never found a way to defeat, because it came from her. Martha looked at the sweater on the bed. Then she did something she did not do often. She rose from the chair. Slowly, one hand braced on the armrest, the oxygen tube trailing with her. She stood, and she walked to the bed on her own, and she picked up the gray sweater herself, and she held it against her chest, and she looked down at it. For the first time in a very long while, she was preparing for something meant for herself, not getting ready for the hospital, not getting ready for a visitor, getting ready to go out, to a beautiful place, because her granddaughter wanted her to go, and because today she was 76 years old, and perhaps 76 deserved one evening unlike all the others. She stood by the bed, the sweater held against her chest, and she smiled, small, for herself, not for anyone else to see. Marin said, "I'm going to pick up your medicine. 30 minutes. Don't go anywhere." Martha said, "Where would I go?" Marin headed for the door. She took her bag. She walked to the pharmacy on Dorchester Avenue just like every Monday. But today was Tuesday, because she wanted Martha to have enough medicine before dinner. 30 minutes. 10 minutes there. 10 minutes waiting. 10 minutes back. She had walked this route hundreds of times, and through all those hundreds of times, Martha had always been home when she returned. The apartment was quiet. Martha was alone. She laid the sweater back on the bed. She turned toward the chair by the window. She sat down. The afternoon sunlight fell through the window onto her hands. She coughed, light at first, then not light. The coughing went on longer than usual, deeper than usual, coming from somewhere in her chest she knew too well because she had lived with it for 3 years. But today it was different. It didn't stop when she wanted it to stop. It went on, and her chest tightened, and air became something she had to fight for instead of something that came on its own. She grabbed for the arm of the chair. Her hand slipped. She slid from the chair. Her knees hit the floor first, then her hands, then her hip. She lay on the floor of the small South Boston apartment, the afternoon sunlight still falling through the window onto the place where she had just been sitting. The chair empty, the oxygen tube pulled taut, and she could not breathe. The phone, on the floor beside the chair leg, where it always stayed because Marin kept it there for her, because Marin was afraid of this exact moment. Martha's fingers found the screen. 911. She pressed it before her vision blurred, because Martha Calloway had lived 76 years by doing what needed to be done before her body had the chance to refuse. The ambulance arrived at 2:31 in the afternoon. Marin came home at 2:40, the bag of medicine in her hand. She opened the door. The door was unlocked. She stepped inside. The chair by the window was empty. The afternoon sunlight fell across the empty chair. The oxygen machine hummed beside it, because no one had turned it off. On the floor, her grandmother's phone lay face down, the screen still lit, 911 still visible on it. The gray sweater lay on the bed, pressed flat, clean, untouched by anyone. Marin stood in the middle of the empty apartment. The bag of medicine slipped from her hand. She didn't pick it up. She looked at the empty chair. She looked at the oxygen machine humming. She looked at the phone face down on the floor, and the world shifted under her feet in the way it only shifts when you come home, and the person you love most is no longer there, and everything in the room is exactly the same except for the one thing that mattered most. Boston Medical Center, 4th floor, room 412. The fluorescent light overhead showed no mercy to anyone lying beneath it, because it shone straight down, evenly, without shadow, and under that kind of light everything looked more exposed than it ever needed to. Martha Calloway lay in the hospital bed, breathing tube in her nose. Monitor wires running from her chest to the screen blinking beside her. The green line moving across, rising, falling, steady, rising, falling. The only sound in the room besides the soft pulse of the oxygen machine. She looked smaller in a hospital bed, smaller than in the chair by the window at home, smaller than in the memory of anyone who had known her when she was strong. Her body had been something she had to negotiate with for 3 years now. But today, beneath the thin white sheet, beneath the unforgiving fluorescent light, it was clearer, collarbone pressing against the neckline of the hospital gown, wrists thinner than wrists ought to be, but her back was still straight, even lying down, her pillow flat, her hands folded neatly over her stomach. And if you looked only at her hands and the stillness of the way they rested, you might think this was a woman simply taking a quiet rest, not a woman who had collapsed on the floor of her own apartment 2 hours earlier. Marin sat in the plastic chair beside the bed. Hard chair, cold chair, the kind of hospital chair no one designs for long sitting, because no one wants to imagine that people will have to sit there for a long time. Her cloth bag rested in her lap. Inside the bag, the tin box. Inside the tin box, the $5 left over, and the Il Sogno reservation receipt, Tuesday, 7 o'clock in the evening, 7-course tasting menu for 2. It was now 4 in the afternoon, 3 hours until her grandmother's birthday dinner. Her grandmother lay in a hospital bed with a tube in her nose. Marin looked at her. She had been sitting here since 3, since the moment she ran from the apartment to the hospital by bus, because she didn't own a car. And on the bus, she hadn't cried because she didn't cry in public. And when she reached the emergency room, and they told her Martha was stable now, and was being moved to the 4th floor, she still hadn't cried, because stable wasn't the same as fine. Stable only meant not worse, and she sat in the plastic chair beside her grandmother's bed, and watched the green line on the monitor rise and fall, and still, she did not cry, because if Martha opened her eyes, the first thing she would see would not be tears. Martha opened her eyes. Slowly, her eyelids felt heavier than she wanted them to. She looked at the ceiling first, fluorescent light. Then she turned her eyes to the right. Marin, plastic chair, cloth bag in her lap, eyes dry, but red around the edges because there are things the body does even when you don't give it permission to cry. Martha looked at Marin and read her granddaughter's face in 1 second, because she had been reading that face for 27 years. She said, her voice rougher than usual but still blunt, still direct, still Martha, don't look at me like that. I'm still here. Marin opened her mouth, closed it again, because if she spoke now, her voice would break, and the thing Martha hated most was seeing her cry. Martha looked at her for another moment, then she looked at the cloth bag on Marin's lap. She knew what was inside that bag. She knew about the receipt in the tin box. She knew today was her birthday, and she was lying here instead of sitting in the restaurant her granddaughter had spent 7 months saving to take her to. She knew all of it. She said, I'm not dying today. Marin looked at her. Martha said, call and cancel the reservation. Rebook it for next week. Lying in a hospital bed, breathing tube in her nose, monitor blinking beside her, and Martha Calloway was worrying about canceling a dinner reservation. Not worrying for herself, worrying for Marin. Worrying that Marin would lose the deposit, or lose the table, or lose something she had spent 7 months building. 76 years old, lying in an emergency room bed, and still thinking of someone else before herself. Maren laughed. Tears came while she laughed because sometimes the body doesn't wait for your permission. It does both things at once. Laugh and cry. Because both are true, and both need somewhere to go. She said, "You're worried about canceling dinner while you're lying here." Martha said, "I'm lying here, but I'm not going anywhere. Next week I'll eat those 7 courses. Don't cancel." Rebook. Silence. The monitor blinked. The oxygen machine breathed softly. The fluorescent light spread evenly over the two of them, grandmother in the bed, granddaughter in the plastic chair, and the dinner receipt for 7 o'clock lay inside the tin box, inside the cloth bag on Maren's lap, like 3 layers wrapped around a promise not yet kept. Then there was a knock at the door. 2 knocks. Maren turned. Brennan McGuire stood in the doorway of room 412. Black coat, no suit. In his hand was a small bouquet, the kind sold at the hospital gift shop downstairs. Thin paper wrapping, white daisies and a few green stems. The kind of flowers no one buys when they've had time to prepare, but everyone buys when they haven't had time to prepare anything else. Maren looked at him. She said, "What are you doing here?" Her voice wasn't angry, wasn't frightened. It was only the direct question of a woman sitting beside her grandmother's hospital bed, who did not understand why the man who owned the restaurant that had thrown her out the other day was now standing at the door of a hospital room, with white daisies in his hand. Brennan didn't look at Maren. He was looking at the old woman in the bed. He had gone to Maren's apartment that morning. Connor had found the address by 6 in the morning. Brennan arrived at 10. The door was open. The chair by the window was empty. The oxygen machine hummed beside the chair where no one sat. The gray sweater lay on the bed, pressed flat, untouched by anyone. He understood. Connor checked the 3 nearest hospitals within 40 minutes. Boston Medical Center. 4th floor, room 412. And now he stood in the doorway, and the old woman in the bed was looking at him, and he was looking at her. Martha looked at Brennan's face. Not a passing glance. Not the way an old woman looks at a stranger stepping into a hospital room. She looked at him the way she looked at everything in life. Straight on, clear, without circling around it. And something moved through her eyes faster than thought, faster even than the illness pressing on her chest could hold back. Something from very far away came rushing back. Something that 76 years of living had not been enough to make her forget. She said 2 words. "Little B." The hospital room went still. The monitor blinked. The oxygen machine breathed softly. Those 2 words stood in the middle of the white room beneath the fluorescent lights like a door swinging open that no one inside had been prepared to see open. Maren froze. She looked at her grandmother. She looked at Brennan. Then she looked back at her grandmother. You know him. Not only knew him, she had a name for him. An old name. A name from before Maren was born. From before the South Boston apartment. From before the lung disease. From some part of her life Maren had never once heard about. Brennan stood in the doorway, and those 2 words hit him harder than any punch he had taken in 15 years in the underworld, because punches he knew how to absorb. But these 2 words he had made no preparation for. Little B. No one called him that. No one in the world called him that anymore. That name belonged to Old Colony. Belonged to the 3rd floor apartment. Belonged to the 12-year-old boy who was taller than the year before and thinner than the year before, and the only person besides his mother who had ever called him by that name was Martha Calloway downstairs. The woman who knocked every night. 2 knocks, a plate of rice, eat while it's hot, then turned away. He walked into the room. He didn't say anything. He set the cheap bouquet of white daisies on the bedside table. He pulled the 2nd plastic chair up beside Martha's bed. He sat down. He didn't kneel. He sat, at eye level with her, the way the 12-year-old boy had once sat on the kitchen floor in the Old Colony apartment eating the hot rice she brought upstairs, sitting on the floor because the kitchen table was where his mother sat, and he hadn't wanted his mother to get up and give him her chair. So he sat on the floor, level with Martha's eyes whenever she stood in the doorway, and now he sat in the plastic chair level, with her eyes in the hospital room, because Martha Calloway had never wanted anyone to look up at her. She wanted people to look straight at her. He spoke, slowly, with more weight in his voice than his voice usually carried. Steady, but the steadiness of a man holding something very heavy, not something light. He said, "I never got to thank you." He said, "For 3 years you knocked on my door every night. 2 knocks, always 2 knocks. You handed my mother a plate of rice. You said eat while it's hot. You turned away. You never stepped inside. You never asked what we needed. You never looked over my mother's shoulder into our empty kitchen. You never waited for thanks. Not once in 3 years did you ever bring it up again. Not once did you make my mother feel 1 millimeter smaller for needing help. You only knocked, handed it over, spoke, and turned away. Every night. 3 years. He stopped, swallowed, not because he was about to cry, but because 25 years were moving through his throat, and 25 years take time to pass through. He said, "My mother cried after you left every night, not because she was ashamed, because she was relieved, because in a world that kept moving past us as if we were invisible, every night there was one person who stopped and decided that we mattered, and that person was you." He said, "I built everything I have on the memory of that. Every time someone told me I didn't belong somewhere, every time someone looked at me like I was that boy from Old Colony who had no right to sit at the same table with them, I thought of you knocking on that door. I thought of the hot plate of rice. I thought of the 20 seconds you stood in the doorway and then turned away because you understood that standing there longer than 20 seconds would turn help into pity. I thought of the sewing tin on your kitchen table that I saw over your shoulder every night for 3 years. The hospital room stayed quiet. Martha looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but she did not cry, because Martha Calloway did not cry in front of other people. Not because she was hard, but because she had spent her whole life being strong for other people. And habits like that do not stop simply because you are lying in a hospital bed. Marin sat in the plastic chair on the other side of the bed. Silent, she was listening to a stranger tell her about her grandmother, about a part of her life she had never known, a part her grandmother had never spoken of. 3 years of knocking on a neighbor's door every night and feeding a hungry boy and his mother with a plate of hot rice. She had lived with Martha for 27 years. Not once had Martha said a word about it. Marin spoke softly. "You never told me." Martha turned her eyes toward her granddaughter. Quick, sharp, her voice blunt, straight, immediate. Not 1 second of hesitation, because this was not something she needed to think about. This was something she knew more clearly than almost anything else she had ever known in her life. She said, "Told you what? The neighbors were hungry, so I cooked rice." What is there to tell? 10 words. The hospital room stayed quiet after those 10 words. The monitor blinked. The oxygen machine breathed. Those 10 words stood in the center of the room, and nobody said anything more because nobody needed to. Those 10 words already held everything. All 76 years of Martha Calloway's life. The whole way she looked at the world. The reason she did what she did. And the reason she never once thought it was something worth telling. The neighbors were hungry, so I cooked rice. What is there to tell? Martha lifted her hand, slowly. A thin hand, the bones of her fingers showing beneath papery skin. The IV needle taped to the back of that hand with a strip of white medical tape, the line running up to the fluid bag hanging from the stainless steel pole beside the bed. She placed her hand against Brennan's cheek. Her hand was warm. Not warm because the hospital room was warm, because it wasn't. It had that hospital coldness. The kind no one ever fixes, because no one stays here long enough to complain. Her hand was warm, because her hand had always been warm, from 25 years ago, when it passed a plate of rice across a doorway every night until now, resting on the cheek of a 37-year-old man sitting in a plastic chair level, with her eyes in a hospital room. That hand was warm because it had spent a lifetime doing the kinds of things that keep a hand warm. Cooking rice, mending clothes, folding blankets, carrying things to neighbors, holding her granddaughter, and 76 years of doing those things had kept her hands warm, even while the rest of her body was growing colder. She looked at Brennan. Straight on. Clear. Her eyes wet but not spilling over, because Martha Calloway controlled tears the way she controlled everything else in life, by pure will. She said, "Your kitchen cabinet was empty. I had an extra portion. What was so complicated about that?" 14 words. Brennan sat still. Her hand on his cheek, warm, light, and those 14 words answered the question he had carried for 25 years about why she had done what she did. He had thought about it on thousands of nights. He had built all kinds of explanations for it in his mind. Kindness, sacrifice, nobility. And Martha Calloway lay in a hospital bed and said, "Your kitchen cabinet was empty. I had an extra portion." What was so complicated about that? No kindness, no sacrifice, no nobility. Only simplicity. You were hungry. I had rice, so I brought it over. What was so complicated about that? Brennan said nothing. because those 14 words had just done something that 25 years of thinking had never managed to do. They had reduced everything to its true size, small in her eyes, enormous in his, and the distance between those two ways of seeing was the distance between the one who gives and the one who receives. And she would never understand why he was moved, because in her mind it was not some great story. It was only rice. Martha kept her hand on his cheek. She looked at him, and something changed in her eyes. Slower now, heavier, as if she were moving from memory into the present, from the 12-year-old boy to the 37-year-old man sitting before her, and she wanted to know where that boy had gone over the last 25 years and what kind of man he had become. She asked, her voice slower than any sentence she had spoken in the entire conversation, heavier. This was the question she had kept ready in her heart for any child she had ever helped raise, the one question that mattered, the one she would ask whether she was lying in a hospital bed, or sitting in the chair by the window, or standing on the steps in Old Colony, because that question did not depend on place, only on the kind of person she was. She said, "Did you build anything worth a damn?" 7 words. Brennan looked at her. Crime boss over half of South Boston. The butcher. The man half the city feared and the other half owed. Gambling. Protection rackets. Loans. Dirty money washed through a chain of restaurants and laundromats. McGuire Holdings. 15 years spent building an empire where not every brick was clean, not every dollar was clean, not every decision was one the 12-year-old boy eating rice on the kitchen floor in Old Colony would have been proud of. Did you build anything worth a damn? He could have lied. He lied every day. He lied to the police, lied to partners, lied to banks, lied to the world, but he did not lie to the hand resting on his cheek, because that hand had fed him truth for 3 years, and he owed it at least the truth in return. He said, "I'm trying. It hasn't all been clean." Martha looked at him. No blink, no frown, no nod, no shake of the head. She looked at him the way she had looked at everything all her life. Straight, clear, without illusion, without judgment, without forgiveness. Because judgment was not her job, and forgiveness was not her job either. She was not a priest. She was not a judge. She was Martha Calloway. She cooked rice for hungry neighbors, and she asked the children she had once fed whether they had built anything worth a damn, and if the answer was not entirely, then she did not judge, and she did not forgive. She said the only thing that needed saying. She said, "Then keep trying." 4 words. Not absolution, not blessing, not a green light. Just 4 words. Blunt, direct, practical, Boston all the way to the bone. Then keep trying, meaning she had heard him. She was not passing sentence, but she was also not saying, "It's all right," because she never said it's all right when it was not yet all right. She only said, "Keep trying," because that was the only thing she believed in. Not perfection. Keep trying. Brennan looked at her and understood that those 4 words were the most she would ever give him, and also the most he deserved to receive. And somehow it was enough. More than enough. More than any forgiveness would have been, because it was real. Silence. Then Martha lifted her hand from his cheek. She looked toward the bedside table. She looked at the small bouquet of white daisies wrapped in thin paper lying there. She said, "Hospital flowers. Cheap as hell. Put them over here." Brennan looked at her, and the laugh slipped out of him before he could stop it. Not the laugh he used in boardrooms, not the laugh he saved for the press and partners and charity galas where people invited him because of his money, not because of him. A real laugh. From before all this, from Old Colony, from the 12-year-old boy sitting on the kitchen floor eating hot rice and feeling something loosen in his chest because someone on the other side of the wall cared whether he had eaten. That laugh, Martha watched him laugh. Then she pointed at him, a thin finger, IV needle taped to the back of her hand, plastic line trailing after it. She pointed straight at his face. She said, "You still laugh exactly the same way you did at 12. Marin rose from the plastic chair. She said softly, "I'm stepping out for a minute." She didn't say it to anyone in particular, not to her grandmother, because Martha was watching Brennan laugh, and in that moment she didn't need Marin, not to Brennan, because he was inside a moment that had taken 25 years to come back to him all at once, and she did not belong inside that moment. She stepped out of room 412. The door closed gently behind her. The hospital hallway, long, white. Fluorescent lights ran in rows along the ceiling, the same kind of unforgiving light as in her grandmother's room, spreading itself evenly across the polished tile floor and the white painted walls and the closed doors lining both sides. The smell of disinfectant, the smell of a place no human being truly wants to be, and yet the smell of the place human beings have to be when their bodies decide that ordinary life must pause for a while. The sound of a rolling cart somewhere far down the corridor, wheels moving over tile, steady, fading. The beep of a machine in another room through a thin wall, the sound of a nurse's shoes against the floor, light, quick, familiar with this place in a way Marin never wanted to become familiar with it. She walked down the hallway, not toward anywhere in particular. She walked only because the hospital room was too small for 3 people, and for what had just happened inside it. And she needed space to hold the thing opening up inside her chest, the thing she still had no name for. She had just sat still for 15 minutes, listening to a man she had met for the first time yesterday tell her about her grandmother, a part of her grandmother's life she had not known existed. 3 years. 3 years Martha had knocked on a neighbor's door every night and brought up a plate of hot rice to a single mother and her 12-year-old son. 3 years without missing one night, not once mentioning it later, not once telling the story. Marin had lived with her for 27 years. Martha had taught her how to tie up her hair. Martha had taught her how to sew on a button. Martha had taught her how to cook rice in an old pot, on an old stove, when Marin was 10 years old, standing behind her saying, "More water, lower heat, don't lift the lid," and Marin listened. Because whatever tone her grandmother used, Marin listened. Because Martha's voice was the safest sound she knew, 27 years. And not one time had she said a word. Not because she was hiding it. Hiding is when you have something and choose not to let anyone see it. Martha wasn't hiding anything, because in her own mind, there was nothing there to hide. The neighbors were hungry, so she cooked rice. What was there to tell? She didn't speak of it because she didn't think it was something worth speaking of. And that was the very thing opening up inside Marin now, heavy and warm at the same time, because it meant her grandmother had given so much that she no longer even recognized herself as giving. It had become her. It was not something she did. It was who she was. Marin stopped in the middle of the hallway. She leaned her back against the wall. The wall was cold through her Goodwill coat. She closed her eyes. And standing there beneath the fluorescent lights, in the 4th-floor hallway of Boston Medical Center, she saw something she had never truly seen before, even though it had been there her entire life. Martha, 3 years of knocking every night to feed hungry children next door, never telling it, never bringing it up. Not once. Her mother, Kathy Calloway, working the night shift at a food packaging plant from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, so Marin could have health insurance and Martha could have medicine money. Every night her mother kissed her forehead before leaving, smelling of cheap soap and exhaustion. And every morning when Marin woke, her mother was already asleep, because the night shift took everything from her mother, except the reason her mother worked the night shift. Her mother gave something away every night, her health, her sleep, her time, until the last night, when the truck took the final thing she still had left to give. Her mother never told that story either, never had the chance, gone too young, 32 years old. Marin had been 9, and now Marin, 27 years old. 7 months of saving every dollar in her grandmother's sewing tin. $12 a week saved by picking up the medicine herself instead of paying for delivery. Every month shaving off a little more from the food budget, from bus fare, from the small things she gave up so the tin box would grow heavier by a few more grams. 7 months without telling anyone, without posting a picture of the box anywhere, without mentioning it to coworkers, without texting anyone to say I'm saving up for Grandma's birthday, without waiting for anyone to know. Without waiting for anyone to praise her. She was the next link in the chain. Her grandmother gave without telling. Her mother gave without ever getting the chance to tell. She gave without needing to tell. 3 generations of women in one family, and none of the 3 ever spoke a word about what they gave away. Not because they were hiding it, but because in the minds of all 3 of them it was not something worth talking about. She stood in the hospital hallway, her back against the cold wall, her eyes closed. And for the first time in her life she saw the straight line that joined her grandmother, her mother, and herself into a cord no one needed to see in order for it to exist. And she understood. For the first time she understood why she had not cried when Deirdre threw her out of the restaurant, why she had gone out through the front door instead of the back, why she had sat on the front step with her back straight and the tin box on her lap, and had not folded in on herself. Not because she was strong, because Martha had taught her. not with words. Martha had never once sat her down and said, "Marin, you have to be strong. You have to keep your dignity. You have to stand straight when people try to bend you." She never said it. She did it. Every day. She got up early, and she cooked rice, and mended clothes, and paid rent, and took her medicine, and sat with her back straight in the chair by the window, and never complained, and never performed her suffering, and never let Marin see her, weak, because she believed the only way to teach someone how to live was to live in front of them. And Marin had seen it. For 27 years she had seen it, and now she stood in the hospital hallway and understood that dignity was not something other people grant you. It was not something Deirdre could take away with a polite smile. It was not something that lived in shoes or coats, or the amount of money inside a tin box. It was something you carried. Martha carried it. Her mother carried it. She carried it, and she would keep carrying it, because it was the one thing 3 generations of Callaway women had passed to each other without ever needing to say it aloud. Marin opened her eyes. She pushed her back away from the cold wall. She walked back down the hallway toward room 412, but she didn't go in right away. She turned toward the elevator and went down to the ground floor, the small food counter near the main lobby, the kind of place no one goes because they want to, only because they need to. The glass case holding prepackaged sandwiches, bottled water, cut fruit in plastic containers, and a tray of muffins sitting in the bottom corner. Marin looked at the tray of muffins. Blueberry. $3 each. She took one. She paid. $3 from her wallet, not from the tin box, because the tin box was for her grandmother, and these $3 were hers. She carried the muffin back upstairs to the 4th floor. In the left pocket of her coat rested a small bag of birthday candles, 76 candles. She had bought them 3 weeks earlier at the grocery store on Dorchester Avenue, the thin, colored kind sold in packs, and she had needed to buy 3 packs to make 76, and she had hidden them in her bedroom drawer beside her watch. And every morning when she opened that drawer to take out her watch before work, she saw them lying there, 3 packs of colored candles, and she thought, it's getting close now, and something in her chest was hope and love, and the particular ache of wanting something so fiercely that you had already started to fear how much it would mean when it finally arrived. And now it had arrived, not the way she had imagined, not in the most beautiful restaurant in South Boston, with white linen and crystal glasses and 76 candles burning on a cake. She had not yet even decided what kind to order. But here, room 412, hospital bed, fluorescent lights, monitor blinking, breathing tube, and Martha lying there. She stepped into the room. Brennan was still sitting in the plastic chair beside the bed. Martha was saying something to him about Moira from the cafe, asking whether she still kept the place open, and Brennan was answering that she did, that she still asked after his mother every time he stopped in, and Martha gave a small nod and said Moira was good. She had always been good. And the conversation was so ordinary it almost didn't seem real, because 10 minutes earlier, these 2 people had been speaking of 25 years of debt and plates of rice, and now they were talking about Moira from the cafe, like 2 old acquaintances, meeting again on an ordinary afternoon. Marin set the muffin on the table beside the bed. Martha looked at the muffin. Marin took the bag of candles from her coat pocket, 76 candles. She looked at them in her hand. She looked at the muffin. She looked at the hospital room. She knew she could not light 76 candles in a hospital room. She knew about the smoke detector on the ceiling. She knew about the oxygen in the room. She knew all of it. She pulled out 1 candle. Just one. She pressed it into the center of the $3 blueberry muffin. She took a lighter from her pocket because she always carried one. Not because she smoked, but because Martha had once used an old gas stove that had to be lit by hand, and Marin had kept the habit even after her grandmother switched to an electric stove. She lit the flame. The little candle caught, burned, a trembling yellow light in the white hospital room, 1 candle on a $3 muffin on the table beside the bed for a 76-year-old woman lying in a hospital bed with a breathing tube in her nose on a Tuesday afternoon. Her birthday, in room 412, beneath unforgiving fluorescent lights. Martha looked at the candle. She said, "Just 1 candle." Marin said, "1 candle stands in for 76. Blow it out." Martha looked at her granddaughter, looked at the candle.